So now you're heading into finishing up your bead weaving. You should have your last row on there. And now what you're going to do is you are going to essentially do what's called burying the string. So that green weaving string that I've been working with. So your design should look like your concept drawing that you did. And now I'm going to turn this and essentially what's going to happen is you need to go back 3 rows of beads. And what I mean by that is I'm kind of drawing the last 3 rows of beads right here. We're just kind of pretending that they're green because that's the marker that I had. And then I'm drawing the warp strings, so in black. So you've got these up and down warp strings that they're in between. And what you're going to do with that weaving string, which I will draw in yellow here, is you're going to weave them back in between each other. Now, where exactly you weave doesn't really matter as long as you go kind of through the beads again. And so this is the way that you went, right? You went through them from the left and then you went back. But when you bury the string, you're just gonna pick a couple, go through them. You have to make sure that you go to the bead directly underneath it or directly above it and go through like the other beads. You don't want to go diagonally because then you're going to see that weaving string show through there. You always have to go to the one directly above, directly beneath. You can go through one, you can go through two, but you don't want to go through the entire row when you're burying the string. You just need to go through just a few. And as you watch, I'm just going to go through those first top two. You always want to make sure that your string just remains as a single string. You don't want to get it doubled up on you. And then you just continue until you are out of string or you're confident that your weaving string isn't going to come out. And once you have that done, then you just go ahead and snip that weaving string. And then your next 2 strings that you're going to do will be the start of the warp strings. So you'll do the 2 end warp strings and you'll bury those as well in your weaving. And so I think I'm getting to the point where I'm pretty confident that this is just about buried and it's not going to come out. And there we go. Now I'm ready. So I'm just going to go ahead, snip that end. Should have done that a little bit closer, but that's all right. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the warp strings and just continue. And I will do the same thing on the other side as well. All right, so now I'm flipping it over and I'm going to go ahead and do the other side. And I want to find that weaving string first, and that is taped to the back. So I'm going to untape that and get that threaded on my needle. And then I have to bury that string as well as the other 2 warp strings. And you got to make sure that you leave enough space when you cut so that way you can get those woven in there or buried in there. So you'll notice that I did more than just the two end ones. I'm essentially leaving two to tie on the clasp and the ring. Um, and when I pull this off, so you'll notice I left those two, but I accidentally did the wrong space. So I like to have the two center ones, but all I'm going to do is go ahead and thread the needle through one of the uh, other spaces, and that way that will shift that string over and it'll make it a whole lot easier to tie. You could leave four, you could leave two, doesn't really matter. Um, but I'm going to go ahead and tie that through that other location there. And now all I'm doing is just crisscross tying to make sure that those two warp strings that are left are tied together nice and tautly. And then I'm going to add either a ring or a clasp. You'll need a clasp on one end and a ring on the other. So now that I'm done with this side, I have my two warp strings tied together. Remember I said you could do four if you want to, but what I'm going to do with this side is I'm going to bury those two end strings because I like to make sure that things are even. So if I end up with two warp strings being tied together on one side, I like to have two warp strings tied together on the other side. But you can do four, like I said. So you can just tie the four together. I'm just going to go ahead and do this with two. So I'm going to tie these two warp strings together just to make a knot. And then I'm going to find myself a clasp and a ring to tie onto my warp strings. And then I can be done. Now, these are clasps and these are rings. So you'll just need one of each. And I'm going to pick up just one of those warp strings and put my clasp on through the little loop. There's a loop at the end of the clasp, and make sure it is as close to the weaving as I can get it. And then I'm just going to crisscross tie that on there. And then I do the same thing with the ring on the other side. So it just needs to go through one of the warp strings, not both of them, and make sure that I tie that. I don't want to snip too closely because I don't want to unravel things. And now the same thing with the ring on the other side. I go ahead, grab my ring, put it through one of the warp strings, and then tie it together.